Before the German invasion actually began in June of 1941, Soviet factories had produced fewer than 2,000 examples of a brand new submachine gun still working through its own earliest production growing pains. By the end of that same year, roughly 90,000 had actually left Soviet factories. The following year, 1942 alone, Soviet industry actually produced 1.5 million more. No NATO member nation's own peacetime small arms industry has ever actually needed to sustain anything close to that same production acceleration, and none in the entire history of the alliance ever actually has. This is the story of the PPSh-41. The submachine gun Soviet factories actually built faster than any NATO nation's own industrial base has ever needed to count, and the specific engineering decisions that made a production speed this extreme actually possible in the first place. Every week, we take apart the story stamped on the receiver of a firearm, the designers, the soldiers, and the decisions that built a legend or lost one. Subscribe if that is the kind of history you want more of. Georgy Shpagin, the same designer this channel has already covered, in connection with the DSHK heavy machine gun, began developing the weapon that would eventually carry his own name specifically to solve a manufacturing problem. The existing Soviet PPD-40 submachine gun had never actually managed to overcome. The PPD required considerably skilled machining to actually produce its own milled receiver, a manufacturing bottleneck that limited production to a small number of specialized armament factories already operating at their own practical capacity, exactly the kind of constraint the Soviet Union could not actually afford once a genuine continent-spanning war against Germany had already become an obvious near-term possibility by the late 1930s. Shpagin's own design entered formal state trials in October of 1940, actually beating a competing submission from Vasily Degtyaryov, the considerably more established designer this channel has already covered extensively, and the Defense Committee formally adopted Shpagin's own weapon on December the 21st, 1940, barely 6 months before the German invasion actually began. Before we get into exactly what made Shpagin's own specific design so radically faster to actually manufacture than anything that had come before it, if you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps the channel keep telling these stories. Here is the specific engineering decision that actually made this entire production story possible. Shpagin built the weapon's own receiver from 2 stamped sheet steel halves, welded together rather than machined from a solid steel block the way the PPD and nearly every conventional firearm of the era actually required, a manufacturing approach that let ordinary metal stamping presses, equipment already common across countless Soviet industrial facilities that had never built a single firearm before, actually produce the weapon's own core structural component. The barrel itself required no dedicated new tooling at all, cut directly from Mosin-Nagant rifle barrel blanks already in mass production for the Soviet Union's own standard bolt-action service rifle, meaning Shpagin's design consumed existing industrial capacity rather than demanding an entirely new supply chain built from scratch during a wartime emergency that offered no realistic time for any such extended development process. The finished weapon contained just 5 machine parts in its own entire design, every other component either stamped, welded, or otherwise produced through manufacturing processes any competent industrial facility, regardless of whether that same facility had ever previously built military equipment of any kind, could actually learn to execute within weeks, rather than the months or years specialized weapons manufacturing traditionally required. That specific manufacturing philosophy meant the PPSh-41 could actually be produced at factories with 0 prior firearms manufacturing experience whatsoever, a considerably radical departure from how every other major combatant nation of the entire war actually approached small arms production. Factory number 367, a newly constructed facility specifically built in Zagorsk purely to actually manufacture the new weapon, represented exactly this kind of purpose-built wartime production solution, though even that dedicated factory initially struggled to actually reach meaningful output, producing fewer than 2,000 complete weapons before the German invasion actually began that June. The genuine production explosion arrived only once the full scale of the German threat had already forced Soviet industrial planners to actually mobilize dozens of additional factories across the entire country. Facilities that had never previously manufactured firearms, actually retooling specifically to produce Spagen's own considerably simplified design once the war's own existential stakes had made that same rapid industrial conversion an absolute national priority rather than merely one competing wartime production goal among many others. Here is exactly how dramatically that same production curve actually accelerated once Soviet industry had fully mobilized behind the weapon. 1941's own total production, spanning the war's own catastrophic opening months when German forces advanced deep into Soviet territory and directly threatened several of the country's own most important industrial centers, reached only roughly 90,000 complete weapons. 1942 alone then actually produced 1.5 million additional units, a 17-fold increase in a single year achieved, while the Soviet Union was simultaneously evacuating entire factories eastward ahead of the advancing German army, relocating irreplaceable industrial equipment and skilled workers across thousands of miles specifically to actually keep production running at all under conditions that would have completely halted almost any comparably complex manufacturing program anywhere else in the entire world. Spagin himself came from considerably humble beginnings within the Soviet arms industry, working initially as an armorer and weapons repairer at the Kovrov Arms Plant, the same facility this channel has already covered in connection with Vasily Degtyaryov's own extensive design career before actually transitioning into weapons design himself. That practical, hands-on background, repairing and maintaining existing Soviet weapons in real field conditions, gave Spagin a markedly different perspective than many of his own more academically trained contemporaries. A designer who had already spent years directly observing exactly which mechanical failures and maintenance headaches actually plagued Soviet small arms in genuine field use before he ever actually sat down to design a completely new weapon meant to avoid those exact same documented problems from the very beginning of the design process. The specific factory evacuation effort that actually sustained PPSh-41 production through the war's own most desperate opening phase deserves considerable attention in its own right, since Soviet industrial planners moved entire manufacturing operations, including irreplaceable specialized machinery, skilled technical personnel, and considerable raw material stockpiles eastward across thousands of miles, specifically to actually keep production running once German forces had already begun threatening several of the country's own most important existing industrial centers. That evacuation effort, executed under genuine wartime emergency conditions, with German forces advancing rapidly and railway capacity already stretched thin supporting active military operations, represented one of the most logistically demanding industrial relocations in the entire history of modern warfare, and the fact that PPSh production actually accelerated dramatically during and immediately after that same evacuation period speaks directly to how thoroughly Spagin's own manufacturing philosophy had actually anticipated exactly this kind of decentralized, resource-constrained production environment from the very beginning of the weapon's own original design process. This is not a story about the Soviet Union simply throwing overwhelming numbers of workers at a straightforward manufacturing problem, since achieving that specific production curve required genuine engineering sophistication in service of manufacturing simplicity, a design deliberately engineered from its own very first blueprint, specifically to actually minimize the skilled labor, specialized tooling, and scarce raw materials any wartime production program actually needed to conserve. It is a story about how thoroughly a single design philosophy, build for the factory rather than for theoretical peak performance, could transform an already desperate wartime manufacturing crisis into one of the most successful mass production achievements in the entire history of firearms manufacturing, a weapon whose own genuine mechanical simplicity turned out to matter considerably more to the war's own actual outcome than any single marginal performance advantage. A more sophisticated, more expensive design might have theoretically offered instead. The PPSh-41's own distinctive 71-round drum magazine carries its own considerably ironic origin story, worth understanding directly since the design traced almost directly back to the Finnish Suomi submachine gun's own 70-round drum, a weapon Soviet forces had already encountered directly and had come to respect considerably during the brutal Winter War fought against Finland barely a year before Shpagин's own design actually entered production. Soviet planners essentially copied a design feature from the exact enemy that had already inflicted considerable, deeply humiliating losses on Red Army forces during that earlier, smaller conflict, incorporating the Finnish drum's own proven reliability directly into the weapon that would eventually help defeat a considerably larger and considerably more dangerous German invasion barely 18 months later. That same drum magazine, while considerably effective in actual combat use, proved considerably more complex and considerably more expensive to actually manufacture than Soviet planners would have ideally preferred, leading to the later introduction of a simplified 35-round curved box magazine specifically to actually reduce manufacturing complexity once wartime production demands had already stretched Soviet industrial capacity to its own practical limits across dozens of simultaneous production priorities. The weapon's own considerable rate of fire, reaching roughly 900 to 1,000 rounds per minute, depending on the specific example and ammunition batch actually tested, represented a deliberate design choice rather than any uncontrolled mechanical byproduct. Soviet infantry doctrine, increasingly built around massed, close-range automatic fire, specifically suited to the kind of brutal, urban, and trench combat that came to define major engagements like Stalingrad, a battle this channel has already covered in considerable detail. By 1943, entire Soviet infantry formations had actually been reorganized specifically around the PPSh-41 as their own primary weapon rather than the standard bolt-action rifle. Complete units equipped almost exclusively with the submachine gun for exactly the kind of close-quarters combat where its own considerable rate of fire and genuine reliability under difficult field conditions actually mattered more than any bolt-action rifle's own longer effective range. German forces encountering the weapon in genuine combat quickly developed real respect for its own documented battlefield performance. Captured examples frequently pressed directly into German service, given how thoroughly the weapon had already proven itself reliable under exactly the same brutal Eastern Front conditions German equipment increasingly struggled to actually handle as the war progressed. German ordnance officers reportedly went so far as to actually convert some captured examples specifically to fire the German 7.6 3x25 mm Mauser cartridge. A genuine engineering effort German forces would never have actually bothered undertaking for a weapon they considered fundamentally inferior to their own comparable equipment. That same captured weapon reputation extended well beyond simple opportunistic battlefield reuse as well. Finnish forces, who had actually captured roughly 2,500 examples during the later continuation war, specifically incorporating them into both frontline and home front service under their own separate Finnish designation, a considerably notable reversal, given that the weapon's own distinctive drum magazine had originally been copied directly from Finland's own earlier Suomi design in the first place. By the war's own conclusion, Soviet factories had actually produced approximately 6 million examples of the PPSh-41, making it the single most produced submachine gun in the entire history of firearms manufacturing, a title the design has continued holding for more than 8 decades since the fighting itself actually ended. Roughly 55% of all Soviet soldiers carried the weapon by the war's own final years, meaning more than half of the entire Red Army's own infantry force actually went into combat carrying a weapon that had not even existed in any meaningful production quantity when the German invasion first actually began barely 4 years earlier. The specific comparison to NATO's own later small arms production history actually illuminates exactly how extraordinary this particular achievement actually was within the broader context of 20th century military manufacturing. No NATO member nation operating under peacetime conditions across the entire Cold War and the decades that followed it ever actually needed to achieve anything approaching a 17-fold single-year production increase for any comparable infantry weapon. since NATO's own institutional planning assumptions never actually required preparing for the specific kind of existential, total mobilization, wartime production emergency the Soviet Union had actually faced and overcome during the opening years of the Second World War. That fundamental difference in institutional context means direct production speed comparisons between the PPSh-41's own wartime manufacturing achievement and any peacetime NATO small arms program inevitably measure two fundamentally different kinds of industrial challenge entirely. The Soviet Union's own achievement reflecting genuine wartime existential urgency. No NATO nation's own peacetime procurement system was ever actually designed to replicate under comparable pressure. The PPSh-41's own influence extended well beyond the Second World War itself as well. Soviet client states and allied nations across the following decade actually receiving surplus examples in enormous quantities. The weapon-arming Chinese Communist forces during that country's own civil war and later Korean War deployment, alongside considerable numbers eventually reaching Vietnamese forces during the opening years of what would eventually become an extended American conflict in Southeast Asia. That continued post-war distribution meant a weapon originally rushed into production specifically to actually meet one nation's own existential wartime emergency ended up shaping the battlefield experience of multiple, entirely separate conflicts across multiple, entirely separate decades. American soldiers in Korea and later Vietnam actually encountering the same basic Soviet design their own father's generation had already faced, captured examples of on the opposite side of the world barely a decade earlier. If you want more stories about the weapons built faster than anyone thought an industrial base could actually manage, subscribe and we will keep finding them for you. See you in the next one.